For the past 30 years, the scientific study of text comprehension has relied on a highly controlled model. Researchers track readers moving sequentially through short, isolated texts to map out exactly how the brain decodes language. The goal in these laboratory settings is to observe how a person builds a coherent mental model of a single, simplified narrative. But this pristine, isolated environment strips away the friction of actual reading. Outside the lab, readers rarely study a single text just to memorize its contents. They cross-reference catalogs, compare conflicting news reports, and scan dense technical manuals. The information is heterogeneous, and the objectives vary wildly from task to task. Surviving this environment requires a different set of cognitive tools. It demands functional literacy, the ability to interpret complex, often fuzzy relationships across multiple overlapping documents. To map the mechanics of functional literacy, we can compare the restricted laboratory view against a generalized real-world view across three primary dimensions: the text, the reader, and the context. Shifting from basic reading to functional literacy requires discarding the assumption that reading is simply a process of absorbing words on a page. The mental architecture involved operates under entirely different rules. Looking at the first row, the text dimension, the traditional model reduces a document to micro-level parameters. It maps out lexical content and tracks how causal and temporal links form between sentences. Under this framework, the document is a static container for semantic meaning. The generalized view recognizes that a text is a physical artifact. It carries structural data and reflects the author's specific communicative intent. These source features, the metadata attached to the document, dictate how the brain processes the actual words. The context of production weighs just as heavily on comprehension as the semantic content. Consider a scientific article. With a publication date of 1905 rather than 2005, a completely different evaluative lens is applied, even if the text itself remains unchanged. Naturalistic texts also deploy macro-level visual cues, like paragraph breaks and bold headings, and distinct typography, embedded directly into the artifact. These physical features operate as active navigational tools that cue the reader's information-seeking strategies. Comprehension in the real world requires evaluating who wrote a document, when it was published, and how it is organized, long before the brain attempts to integrate the actual sentences. Moving to the middle row, the reader dimension, the restricted laboratory view relies on a relatively straightforward cognitive architecture. The reader acts as a biological information processor. Success depends on verbal decoding skills and working memory capacity, continuously looping newly read propositions against a pre-existing database of domain knowledge. The literate agent coordinates parallel evaluations across conflicting inputs, actively adjudicating between separate streams of data. A literate agent possesses explicit declarative knowledge about texts themselves. They understand that different genres and formats carry different levels of authority, allowing them to evaluate source credibility. This evaluation is driven by a specific cognitive mechanism known as the sourcing heuristic. First, the sourcing heuristic interrogates the origin of the document. The reader checks the author's credentials and motives to determine if the semantic content warrants integration into their mental model. Second, it cross-references the incoming data. The reader constantly checks if the current document complements or contradicts information found in previously read sources. When inconsistencies arise, which is common across multiple texts, the literate agent does not just flag the error, they analyze the differing communicative intents of the authors to deduce why the conflict exists. Advanced reading operates defensively. The literate agent deploys these high-level logic gates to filter out unreliable data, actively protecting the accuracy of their internal representation. The final dimension of the matrix is the context, the specific task driving the reading activity. In the laboratory, subjects usually read to prepare for a delayed memory test, but naturalistic reading is strictly purpose-oriented. The specific goal alters the cognitive operations taking place in the brain. One major naturalistic task is document integration. This occurs when a reader needs to extract data from several distinct sources to complete a single, unified assignment. Merging inconsistent information places an immense load on working memory. To maintain coherence, the reader must actively map the source parameters directly onto the semantic content. A second common context is information search. Here, the objective is highly specific: finding a date, a definition, or a key metric amidst a dense field of text. Search demands distinct memory control mechanisms. The reader has to actively hold their specific objective in working memory while being constantly bombarded by incoming, distracting text data. Success relies heavily on cognitive inhibition. The reader scans visual and verbal cues, instantly evaluating and rejecting irrelevant paragraphs without engaging deep processing. This behavior operates in direct opposition to the standard laboratory model. The searcher is intentionally avoiding the construction of a coherent mental model for the whole text. The overall semantic content of the document becomes secondary. The objective is fulfilled simply by matching a fragment of text data directly onto the pre-existing problem framework. In these task-driven contexts, comprehensive understanding is bypassed in favor of utility. Reading functions as an aggressive, highly targeted filtering mechanism. Mapping these three dimensions redefines how we analyze reading. The text functions as an artifact, the reader as a critical agent, and the context as the governing strategy. Functional literacy requires discrete cognitive tools. While basic decoding is the foundation, it lacks the high-level oversight needed to manage multiple computing document models. Competent readers use advanced memory control, strict evaluation of authorial source parameters, and strategic exploitation of visual cues. These prerequisites are mandatory for navigating modern information systems. Digital interfaces present vast, unstructured repositories of data, demanding continuous source evaluation and complex search heuristics. Executing these high-level sourcing and integration tasks is heavily resource-demanding, and research shows these skills are rarely fluent in standard student populations. If educational frameworks continue to assess literacy by testing the short-term retention of single, isolated narratives, they will fail to prepare students for actual text-based work. Building true digital literacy requires engineering training systems that prioritize source evaluation, task-driven search protocols, and the active critical management of conflicting data.